Hello and welcome. This video is going to be working towards lab number 2, dealing with histology. So histology is study of tissues, not facial tissues like you see on the screen here, but the tissues that are going to be used to make up the different organs in the body. There are in fact 4 different tissues, and they are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. In the videos for lab number 2, we are going to be spending a lot of time talking about epithelial tissue and connective tissue. We'll talk just a little bit about nervous tissue and just a little bit about muscle tissue, just enough that you'll be able to identify the 3 different types of muscle tissues that there are. One thing to be aware of is that students sometimes mistakenly combine these different types of tissues together. So they'll say that there is an epithelial connective tissue or muscle connective tissue. Now, these are very common mistakes, and I'm warning you right now, don't fall into this trap. These are easy things to not do. So in this 15-minute video, I'm going to try to cover the different epithelial tissues. Before we get into the specific types, we need to know that epithelial tissues are tissues that are going to cover the body. They're going to line the inside of an organ, a cavity, like the cavities that we saw in lab number 1, or a lumen. And a lumen is the space within a tube. Or in the case of glands, epithelial tissue can form parts of the glands. Now, what do we use epithelial tissues for? Well, we can use them for protection. Those that are on the body surface are going to help protect the outside of the body or the internal structures. Some epithelial tissues, like those within the digestive system, are going to be used for absorbing nutrients and water. Some epithelial tissues, like those in the kidneys, are going to be used in the excretion, the getting rid of extra water and wastes. And some epithelial tissues found in the skin and some other places are also going to help us to detect what's going on inside and outside of the body. Now, when we think of the different epithelial tissues, there's several factors that we need to keep in mind. The first of which is the shape of the cell. And in fact, there's 3 different shapes. You've got squamous cells, which are flattened or plate-like. You've got cuboidal cells, which, as the name implies, are cube-shaped. And you have columnar cells, which are long and skinny column-shaped cells. Now, in addition to that, we can look at the arrangement of the cells, the layers of the cells. So if we say that the cells are simple, that means there's a single layer of cells. Whereas if they're stratified, there's 2 or more layers of those cells. In addition, columnar epithelium can also be pseudostratified. Now, this is a big word. When we break it down, the word pseudo means fake. Stratified means multiple layers. So pseudostratified cells are fake stratified. In other words, when we look at them, superficially it will look like that they are stratified because the nuclei are going to be found at different levels. But actually, it is an example of simple epithelium. Now, when we are naming a tissue, an epithelial tissue, we're going to need to include both the shape and the layers. So we would say simple squamous epithelial tissue, or epithelium. We could say stratified cuboidal epithelium. Or we could say pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Now, please note that not only do you have to spell everything properly, but you have to include epithelium or epithelial tissue as part of the name. And if you don't include these, your answer will be wrong. Okay, so the first tissue we're going to look at is simple squamous epithelium. As the name implies, it is a single layer of flattened plate-like cells. We find simple squamous epithelium in alveoli, those air sacs within the lungs. And when you think about it, it makes sense because we're going to have oxygen and carbon dioxide moving in and out of the lungs and into the blood. So we want the alveoli to be thin. So we want those thin plate-like cells and only a single layer of them. One thing we're going to learn about in Biology 245 when we talk about the urinary system is there's a structure in the kidney called the glomerulus, which is where blood is actually filtered of water, extra water and wastes. So that's going to be made up of simple squamous epithelium so that the water and the wastes can move pretty easily. Endocardium is a layer that's going to line the deepest or inside of the heart, and that's going to be simple squamous epithelium, as are the tissues that are going to line the blood vessels. So you see here an excellent example of simple squamous epithelium. It might not look like it the first time you see it. So when I tell students that are looking at tissues for the first time, I try to tell them not to panic and start with what you know. So taking a look at this tissue here, I see a nice big open space, nice big open space, nice big open space. Hey, this looks like a tube. Okay, and what did we say? Which type of tissue is going to line a tube? Well, epithelial tissue. So just starting off with, before we panic, we see what could possibly be an epithelial tissue. And when we look at the next slide, we're going to zoom in a little bit. And lo and behold, if here is our lumen here, there is a single layer of cells that's going to be surrounding lumen. Let's look at the shape of these cells. This cell here is pretty flattened. This cell here is pretty flat. In fact, it bulges out a little bit around this big dark staining nucleus here. And most of the cells here are pretty flattened. And there's only a single layer of these cells. So this would be simple squamous epithelial tissue. Here is another example. You see the lumen, that tells you this is probably epithelial tissue. Then we have a single layer of squamous cells. So that's simple squamous epithelium, or simple squamous epithelial tissue. Next type of tissue is stratified squamous epithelium. So again, we've got the layer of flattened plate-like cells, but the fact that it's stratified tells us that it's more than one layer of cells. So multiple layers of plate-like cells, and you would find stratified squamous epithelial tissue in the skin pretty commonly, particularly in the epidermis, which is the most superficial layer of the skin. And if you remember from lab number 1, superficial means close to the surface. So this is, the epidermis is the layer of skin that is most superficial, is closest to the surface. Now, some of these stratified squamous epithelial cells are going to be keratinized, meaning that they contain this waterproof protein called keratin that we will be learning about when we talk about the integumentary system. Non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium can be found in the mouth, in the esophagus, which is the tube that leads from the mouth down to the stomach, as well as the vagina. Here you see an example of stratified squamous epithelium. Now notice the big hairy stuff that's sticking off of the top. This is actually a layer that we're going to talk about in lecture called the stratum corneum. It's a layer of dead cells that when they slice this tissue very thinly have started to slough off. The epidermis you see is the darker staining part right here. And when we zoom in by looking at a cell at a higher magnification, you can see superficially these cells are pretty thin and plate-like. Now, interestingly, as we move deep, we're looking at the nuclei of these cells here and the cells around them, and these are a little bit thicker. What happens with stratified squamous epithelium is that the cells that produce all the other cells of the epidermis can be thicker. They can almost be cube-like or column-like. And as mitosis occurs in these cells are pushed superficially, they become squamate, or they become flattened. So by the time we get to the superficial surface right here, We have stratified squamous epithelial cells that are really thin, and the deeper cells can be thicker. And here's another example of thinner, so stratified squamous epithelium in our skin, mainly thinner superficially, and some of them can be thicker, deeper. Next we have simple cuboidal epithelium, and as the name implies, this is going to be a single layer of cube-shaped cells. We can find simple cuboidal epithelium in kidney tubules that are going to be taking the stuff that was filtered out of the glomerulus. We're also going to find that in smaller glands, so both the secretory part that's responsible for releasing the secretions, as well as the ducts that are going to be carrying the secretions away. Also, the surface of the ovary contains simple cuboidal epithelium. Now here we see kidney tubules that have been cut in longitudinal sections. So you see this long, thin lumen that should make you think, we've got epithelial tissue here. And then looking at the cells on either side of the lumen, now some of these do look kind of column-shaped, but when you look at most of them, they are more cube-shaped cells. So it's a single layer of cube-shaped cells. This is simple cuboidal epithelium. Here you see other kidney tubules that are cut in cross-section. So we see our lumen here, there's a lumen here, and a lumen here. When we look, we see a single layer of cube-shaped cells around the lumen, and here we see this at greater magnification. These are definitely cube-shaped cells here. Next type of tissue is simple columnar epithelium. And simple columnar epithelium is made up of a single layer of column-shaped cells. Now, a little hint when we're looking at simple columnar epithelium is goblet cells. Goblet cells are only found in columnar epithelium. So if you see goblet cells, which are shaped, oddly enough, like a drinking glass called a goblet, and these cells are responsible for making mucus. If you find goblet cells, then you absolutely have columnar epithelium. Now be careful, because sometimes columnar epithelium you can't see goblet cells. So the fact that goblet cells are not there doesn't tell you that it's not columnar. But the presence of goblet cells tells you that it most certainly is. And these cells make mucus. Okay, so we've got some columnar epithelium that contains cilia, those little hair-like structures. We would find them in small bronchi, some of the air passageways in the lungs. And we would find ciliated simple columnar epithelium in the uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes, which are responsible for bringing oocytes or egg cells from the ovary into the uterus. As well as some parts of the uterus contain ciliated simple columnar epithelium. Some non-ciliated simple columnar epithelium we might find in the digestive tract, as well as in the gallbladder and the ducts of some glands. So here you see columnar epithelium. You can see this has lots of goblet cells. So this tells us that, and the fact that here is a lumen. So this tells us that we're dealing with epithelial tissue, specifically columnar epithelial tissue. And the fact that the nuclei of all these cells are found so parallel to one another, or found all at the same level, this tells us that this is simple columnar epithelium. Now here we see a cross-section through simple columnar epithelium. So we see our lumen, and you see the single layer of columnar cells going all the way around it. And this is those same cells at a higher magnification. And I will pick up with pseudostratified columnar epithelium in the next video, so stay tuned.